Thank you. So when faced with the tough challenge of dealing with a rock-hard cataract, we need to have specific surgical strategies in place that actually help us suitably downsize them, emulsify them, and help us do it each and every time with a predictable outcome each time. So this is what you need to do. Pre-operatively, we cannot but not include deciding how dense is the endonucleus. Is there any element of a polar element here, if you can see anything? Is the capsular bag stable? What is the status of pupillary dilatation? Because that tells you how large your excess will be and how easy it will be for you to operate. What is the status of the corneal endothelium? You want to make sure that you have an adequate healthy endothelium to decide whether you can do a phaco safely in your hands. And of course, what is your working space? The pre-nucleotomy steps cannot be with any compromise at all. You want to save all your energy in actually downsizing these nuclei. So your incision cannot be too tight, too loose. You don't want fluctuating chambers because of weak incisions. You want to have a capsular rhexis, which is about 5.5 millimeters. That would adequately cover your IOL completely. Plus, if you were to go too small on the size of your rhexis, even accidentally, you tend to have an increased propensity of damage of your capsular bag because of injury either by the chopper or by the slightly excess mechanical separation that you do create when creating a job here. And finally, when you come to the hydrodissection, you have to be slightly more gentle. I tend to be rigorous normally with my hydrodissection because you want to create that wave. But remember that with these rock-hard cataracts, you're working with a large endonucleus which is tightly, snugly fit into this capsular bag. So any overzealous, a very strong jet of fluid can break down the posterior capsule and cause a PC blowout. So slightly more gentle on that. However, the only thing that really matters finally in dealing with these rock-hard cataracts is how you actually break them down. So customizing the breakdown of these nuclei has got three things that you have to take care of. What is the modulation of power that you're going to use? What is the type of energy delivery system that you're going to use? Your instrumentation, and finally the technique. The one and only power modulation that I would recommend, which always works, is the burst mode. You can have continuous, you can have your pulse mode, the conventional with the 50-50 on-off, you can have hyperpulse. But what you really require in these hard cataracts is to be able to penetrate into the nucleus and get a good hold. With the burst mode, what you do in this mode is that it gives identical and specific bursts of energy. When we say identical and specific, we mean the length which denotes the power, and the duration, which is denoted by the width of the burst. And as you control your foot pedal and then go lower and lower down, these bursts of energy are given closer apart, making eventually the gap between them really tiny. You work with the power commensurate with your grade of the cataract, 40, 50, 60, depending on your systems. A high vacuum, because today we want to use as much vacuum as opposed to power to actually emulsify the fragments, and work with a flow rate of about 28 to 30 cc. For the instrumentation, I would recommend that you actually save your newer tips for the harder cataracts. If you were to use your older tips, the amount of energy actually required to be delivered to emulsify them is almost 1.5 times. And certainly you do require a sharp chopper. And the technique that we used is phaco chop. It's the safest, most efficient, and the most physiological. Why most physiological? Just one point to add before I start on the videos. It is a crystalline lens. It's called crystalline because we have pre-existing fracture zones in these lenses. When you have a substance with pre-existing fracture zones, any tiny bit of shear force will actually cause a cleavage plane to appear quite easily and propagation of the crack. Therefore, phaco chop, nothing else. Coming on to the surgeries, this is just take you through the different grades of cataract and doing a good phaco chop and how it really works quite well. This is a grade 3 cataract. You impale, you fixate, and you mechanically subdivide. You're not wasting any energy in actually sculpting a groove. The energy is only delivered to impregnate into the fragment. Then the non-dominant hand has the advanced maneuver of actually creating the mechanical disassembly. Work your way. You may need to do a little more of lateral separation to ensure that the posterior plate is also separated. As you can see here, the surgeon has broken the first heminucleus only into 3 fragments because they are larger nuclei. Another option, instead of doing a direct chop, could be sculpting a groove, trying to work your way slightly lower down and give you less of of tissue to chop. So you work your way, making a groove wide enough, and then you go in, you impale, you fixate, and then create the mechanical disassembly. And as you can see in this video here, you've just cracked it in the upper half, but if you can see, it is auto-propagated and almost most of the nucleus is now separated. Turn it around 180 degrees, break it down into two halves, and then further divide. As the grade of the cataract gets harder, you need to use more energy. You need to expose sometimes slightly more of the tip. And so you can see here, you need to use a longer chopper. So you work with the sharp chopper 1 to 1.5 millimeters and with significant ease. So the energy, the tip burying slightly deeper, and the mechanical chopper all work towards creating the perfect breakdown. So here again, the nucleus broken into three halves, smaller, more emulsifiable fragments. And then again, once you've got your first chop, you actually can see, you have visibility, you know how safe is safe, that the following chops are quite easy. So you no longer rely on the visibility of tissues. And this is coming to a grade 5 cataract. Now you can see here, it's sometimes obviously a little more difficult to create the disassembly here, because as surgeon now impregnates here, the nucleus tends to break. Sometimes it turns, as you'll see in the following steps. See, this is a torque. The torque occurs because you've not impregnated deep enough. Once you're deep enough, so you can do a sequential chop. You go and hold, it doesn't crack, you go further deeper down and then create the disassembly. It's quite easy to go ahead. This is the amorphous cord. The amorphous cord is central dense part which does not have pre-existing lens fibers, does not get involved in the chop, and you have to manage by emulsifying it, bringing it out, and then making room for yourself to work onto the posterior plate. And today, if I had to modify my technique, I do what is called a pulse chop, wherein I impale in a burst mode, I get a good hold, lift up the nucleus, ensure I have fixity, now put the chopper in it, but slightly further away, and I give an extra burst or two of energy, moving both instruments towards each other. And when I do that in those very, very hard cataracts, I find it's easier to be able to facilitate a chop. It just kind of splits open. Plus, I'm not too concerned about using a little extra burst of energy because it is within the nuclear tissue itself. I do that for my following fragments as well. But having said that, that's when all goes well, but it doesn't always go so well because the posterior plate sometimes can be really tough and difficult to deal with. So here are a few videos of what do you do with the posterior plate. Now there's some way you're going to have to get by. You're going to have to separate them and emulsify them. So when you're left with like a flower, you've got, so suppose you're left with like a posterior plate, a thickened posterior plate. One, you can use two dialers, preferably 2 Sinskey hooks under adequate viscoelastic cover to create your mechanical disassembly. Make sure that your dialers don't pop in through, it's going to end up eating up the posterior capsule. And often you find like this in the center, there's that part of the posterior plate that's just not separated. So somehow I try to just bring one of the fragments up, and when I've got that center part slightly further up, I just emulsify it. Here again, sometimes no matter what you do, your posterior plate just comes as one big plate all in itself up there. And the only thing you can really do here is under a lot of viscoelastic cover, because you're working with quite a hard cataract, within this space, you just suitably keep downsizing it on its way up and emulsifying it. Here's another case wherein you're left with it's like a grade 3 to 4 cataract, and you've tried to emulsify, and surprisingly, when you're doing a chop, it appears to have separated fully, and when you start bringing the fragments out, you find that no, it isn't. So either surgeon tries mechanically to create a disassembly, break it down into two halves, but still it seems to be joined a little bit, in which case you just work your way on its way up, coming with fixated here. And this central part that is joined together, you just either do a reverse chop with the second instrument, as I'm trying to do here, or you just give a few bursts of energy and break down that fragment and suitably then keep emulsifying one after the other. And this is what you just call a bad chop. The reason for this is inadequate exposure of the tip, not a very good tip, not adequate burial, and not a good chopper. So this is what you don't want, where you're just trying to struggle. The struggle can actually be done away with if you take all the previous points into consideration. And you have to bury deep. This is not adequately deep enough, and therefore I have so much of a torque and so much of need for mechanical, yanking apart the fragments, which is what you do not actually require today. Coming on to my last video. And sometimes then, however, that is just a chop not happening too well. Sometimes, not only does it not chop very well, but you may actually be faced with different issues. Okay. Now here the surgeon is a grade 3 to 4 brown cataract, VIP patient, and has had an accidental nick while doing the rexus, missed it, and while doing the hydrodissection notices that the entire rexus has ripped open. Now, in all sensibility, one should probably ideally just convert and do a decent small incision and get the nucleus out. But one dares to go ahead with the chop because you think that, okay, the tear is at around 11 o'clock and I'm going to chop around 5 or 6. So with great care, reduce your settings, reduce your flow rate, keep your power as much as you require, and a lower vacuum, you try and create the chop. You think you've done a decent job of creating the chop, then you eat up the endonucleus, and when you're trying to work your way at, when the surgeon's actually trying to work his way at getting up the fragments, now not only is it tough, but you ended up catching the iris there as well. And we all know that once you catch the iris, even if you put in the adequate dispersive viscoelastic, it can be a bit tricky in actually emulsifying the rest of the nucleus. And of course you're working with a compromised bag. However, with great care, with adequate OVD cover, one actually managed to emulsify the entire nucleus. However, at the end of this case, though it's not shown here, there was a pelvic extension into the PC and an IOL was placed in the sulcus. Just one more? No, that's not the one. 1 minute more, that's okay. Just like to show you this video. Just a point to be noticed that you can have a subluxation at any point in a cataract. Okay, while emulsifying a rock hard cataract, everything seems to be going well, but the surgeon is actually struggling a little bit, and at some point here notices that the bag has come away, as you can see at 5 o'clock. Now what do you do here? Now, if you do have an intraoperative subluxation in a hard cataract, remember at any point it's quite safe, provided you don't have an opening in the PC or tear in the rexus that's gone behind. You put in adequate OVD, and you can then put in a CTR, either by a hand-on-hand, which is my preferred choice, and this is a fishtail maneuver wherein you can put the bump of it, the central part of it in first, and then get each of the loops to go into the bag. I prefer to do it through the 2.8 because I find that putting in the last bit of the CTR with the McPherson's is easier in my hands. Now having done that, you've got a stable bag now. You have a stable bag, and it's quite safe to then go ahead with the rest of the surgery. And finally, the last 10-15 second clipping. This is a case wherein there is a PCR towards the end while bringing the last fragment out. One point I'd like to make is that however hard these fragments are, it's not very common to actually find the sharp ends of the fragment creating a PCR. I haven't found that to happen in my hands. I find, more importantly, it's an injury caused by either the tip or it's a hypermature cataract and you don't have a stable bag and your bag just jumps up and you catch it in your probe, or most importantly, could be a chopper injury, and even more importantly, it's probably during IA that it happens. Now here, it's happened during the bringing out of the last fragment. You put in a lot of OVD. There doesn't seem to be too much of tissue of vitreous disturbance. The section is enlarged to a 5 mm incision, and the surgeon just very carefully takes out all the fragments under adequate OVD cover, because you cannot use a vitrector to eat fragments, and you cannot use the fragments, you cannot safely use a phaco once you have an opening, after which a 3-piece IOL is quite so simply then put in the bag, and things work quite okay. With that, I come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr.